The final week of the campaign is here, finally. I'm Charlie Sykes. Sunday Insight starts right now. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Insight. In the week that was a year of spectacular fall colors, but if you missed it, well, there's always next year. Ebola comes to New York City, a terrorist attack in Ottawa, Canada. And the president heads to Milwaukee for a campaign rally for Mary Burke and a $16,000 a head fundraiser at a sushi restaurant afterwards. Milwaukee's police union plans a vote of no confidence in Chief Ed Flynn. More John Doe documents dumped 2 weeks before the election by County Executive Chris Avely. Avely is a big Burke donor. Coincidentally, Mary Burke launched a TV ad on the Doe the same day. The World Series begins. The Green Bay Packers lay down a beatdown on the Panthers and get ready to take on the Saints later today. But we start with the home stretch in the race for governor. 4 polls, all showing the same thing. The race between Scott Walker and Mary Burke is dead even. 2 of the polls have Walker up by 1 point. 1 poll has Burke up by 1 point. And the Marquette University Law School poll has the race tied. As the candidates head into the home stretch, 2 distinctly different strategies. Walker makes his closing case with this positive ad.
Just last month, our reforms helped create 8,400 new jobs. Wisconsin now ranks in the top 4 states in the Midwest for private sector job growth. Not last, in the top 4.
Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports that the Mary Burke campaign plans a pivot to more negative attacks, including a focus on the John Doe investigation like this.
4 years of political fistfights, criminal convictions.
The criminal convictions of 6 Walker aides or supporters.
And secret donations. Tax cuts for the wealthy 10 times the size of yours. And a jobs promise broken.
Now, there's a reason for this. Last week's St. Norbert's poll found this interesting nugget. 61% of Burke supporters say they are voting for her because they dislike Scott Walker, and only 7% because they like her. So that raises this question. Is this really a race between Scott Walker and Mary Burke, or between Scott Walker and anybody but Scott Walker? Now, joining me on our panel this morning, former State Representative Michelle Litchens, Defense Attorney Dan Adams, Media Trackers Brian Sickman. By the way, Linda Bruin is off this week because her father passed away and Michael Holt is still ill. So let's talk about this. Those numbers are really quite striking, aren't they, Brian Sickman? The fact that only 7%.
Absolutely.
So, but does that also explain why the negative attack ads against Mary Burke don't seem to have made any difference whatsoever?
Well, I think Mary Burke is a very undefined individual. She's done very little with her career publicly. Governor Scott Walker has packed a lot into his 4 years as governor. And if you look at this, I mean, he was a legislator before that. He was a county executive before that, or before he became the governor. And yet Democrats are only focusing on his 4 years as governor because they feel that that's where they have a chance to go after him on his record. But that's also where Governor Walker's the strongest because of what he's done.
Is it unfair, though, to say that Mary Burke does not matter in this campaign? It doesn't matter who she is, what she says, anything about her background. The voters right now are locked into either you like Scott Walker or you don't like Scott Walker, that the election turns on a referendum on him regardless of what she says or does.
Oh, big time. Well, listen, every re-election campaign for a big office is essentially a referendum on the incumbent. And this is no different. What Mary Burke had to do, and what I think she's been doing deliberately from day one, was saying, hey, I'm not scary. Right. I am an alternative to something you may not like, and you may want to try that alternative. And again, not saying anything overly provocative that may scare away independents or moderates who may just say, these 4 years have been okay, but we're ready for something.
Well, I think a lot of people were somewhat, taken aback by the fact that even after the plagiarism scandal, it didn't seem to move her numbers. And this St. Norbert's number would certainly suggest that, again, if you put a ham sandwich on the ballot who was not scary, they would be polling at 47, 48%. And is that the case for Mary Burke?
I think that's legitimate. And frankly, you can see Mary Burke's strategy from day one. A lot of people were saying, hey, you need to fill the slate. You need to have something about you that we will
gravitate toward. Here's the interesting test, because so you have the same poll showed that the majority of people who are supporting Scott Walker were in favor of Scott Walker's policies. So which is a stronger, since this is about turnout, what is the stronger motivation? Support, love, or opposition, hate?
Well, unfortunately, I think hatred is a strong motivator, but at the same time, I think people are still far more intense on the Republican side, on the Scott Walker support side, just to make sure he's vindicated and that he is reelected again for governor. But does it matter that Mary Burke is running for governor, that she is who she is? Not at all. And if she mattered at all, the press would have asked her, what has she done with her life for the last 7 years? You know, they would have talked about what she did at Trek, some of her personal life. No one knows and no one seems to care, which is why I think Scott Walker is not out there attacking her and any of her previous policies, because it doesn't matter.
Well, I do think that opposition to a candidate, and especially incumbents' positions and reforms, is a big motivator for turnout. But in Wisconsin, we've had 2 executives to look at for the past 4 years. You know, we've had Governor Scott Walker for 4 years. We've had President Barack Obama for 6 years. And Barack Obama, you know, promised that if you like your health insurance, you can keep it, and then we all lost it. And then Governor Scott Walker said if you like your tax money, you can keep it, and he actually gave a tax cut. So people are going to go to the polls on November 4th, remembering that actually Governor Scott Walker did something for them.
Well, you know, let's go back to this whole issue of, you know, the anti-vote. Every analysis that I've seen would suggest 2 things. Number one, that the liberal allies of Mary Burke are outspending Walker and his liberal allies. Do you agree with that? I mean, and his conservative allies, that they have more money. The big outside unions said they were going to make him their #1 target. They meant it. They are coming in with big money. And almost all of the outside money is attack ads. So there is a certain logic. If Walker's going to be reelected, he is going to have to look into that camera and convince people that he deserves another 4 years, a positive message. For Mary Burke to get elected, she has got to gin up this anti-Walker fervor. Do you see that any differently than that?
She has a lot of help to do it.
A lot of help.
She's also a remarkable person. I mean, she has business credentials. She is a moderate. She's not scaring anybody out of the tent.
None of that's true, of course. I mean, she's a left-wing unemployed Madison millionaire, you know, on the school board, who was a disaster as a commerce secretary. But you know what? It's pointless for me to mention it because it does not matter. Nobody cares about it. I don't know of any candidate for governor who has ever run as many ads that have been labeled deceptive as Mary Burke. But again, it doesn't seem to matter. So I guess the question is going to be, and maybe we'll ask this a couple weeks from now, if she's elected governor, what is her mandate other than to
not be Scott Walker.
Not be Scott Walker. So what is your glass half full? What is your glass half empty? Let's go around the table, and we will start with Michelle Litchens.
Well, my glass is half full because Howard Markline is likely to win the 19th Senate seat. It is half empty because outgoing Senator Dale Schultz is helping the Democrat to win his old seat, exposing his true blue color after all.
Dan Adams.
My glass is half full because downtown Milwaukee is entering a renaissance period of real estate development as new, ambitious projects seem to be announced weekly. This bodes well for our city's aesthetic and tax base. My glass is half empty because the largest future development, the new Bucks Arena, seems to be in troubled water. Milwaukee can't pull this project off. The negative political and economic impact will reverberate for decades.
Brian Sikma.
Well, my glass is half full because once again, Wisconsin's in the national political spotlight with this election. But my glass is half empty because some of the conservative nonprofit groups that would normally be informing and talking to voters about the issues at stake in this election are muzzled because of the partisan John Doe probe started in Milwaukee County District Attorney John Chisholm's office.
Well, my glass is half full because the President of the United States is coming to our town. My glass is half empty because he's going to a $32,000 a couple fundraiser at the sushi bar. So yeah, you peons, you're not invited. Next on Sunday Insight, President Obama will campaign for Mary Burke this week. Who does that help? Two days, 2 presidents. Former President Bill Clinton on Friday. President Barack Obama scheduled for next Tuesday. Mary Burke tries to rally her base and encourage a big turnout by bringing in her party's biggest names, but will it help or hurt? Now, with his poll numbers sagging, Democrats across the country have been keeping Obama at arm's length, some even refusing to say whether they voted for the president, but Burke is going all in. So Dan Adams, explain this dynamic. You have Democrats all around the country who are just, want to be as far away from Obama as possible. Why is Wisconsin different? Why is Mary Burke embracing him?
No Wisconsin voter is changing their vote based on the president coming or Bubba coming. Yeah. It's only going to drive up turnout in the city. Mm-hmm. And as we look at 2010 and the difference between that election and 2012 turnout, we need to make up that gap as Democrats if we're going to win. And ginning up the base here in Milwaukee is the way to do that.
Okay, so you gin up the base in Milwaukee, and it comes down to the African-American vote. I mean, you mentioned both, Tom Barrett and Barack Obama both got more than 70% of the vote back in 2012. The problem was, of course, that Obama got 56,000 more votes, or more than 50,000 votes. Is one visit from the president a week before the election, is that going to generate that kind of a turnout in the African-American community for Mary Burke?
Well, I don't know. And again, we're looking at...
That's why he's coming, though.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. That's the intent. And if it makes the volunteers work a little bit harder, the staff work a little bit harder to get out those marginal voters, that's a huge boon for Democrats.
Okay, the flip side, though, is that the rest of the state watches as well. And most Democrats around the country have avoided being tied to it. In most states, what you're seeing is that Republicans are saying this person is allied to Barack Obama. So how does that play outstate? You're from Oshkosh. How does it play in Oshkosh when people see this very, very unpopular president coming in and campaigning for Mary Burke?
I do think it's going to hurt Mary Burke around the rest of the state. Like you said, their states, people in different states are saying to Obama, don't come here, please. And yet, Wisconsin is inviting her. Mary Burke is inviting President Obama here, which I think is staggering. And the fact that they are inviting President Obama to North Division High School instead of Rufus King, which is a high school we're all very proud of in the community, North Division, that means that he is here for the only purpose of driving up that smaller group of voters that probably was not going to participate.
North Division is also
fall.
not a terribly good high school, but Dan Adams makes an interesting point. He says this is not going to change anyone's mind. It's all about motivation. So will this motivate Republican voters?
It could certainly not motivate Republican voters. You mean it might turn off a couple more even Democrats around the state that aren't excited about it.
I think this kind of strategy, I think Dan Adams is half right in the fact that the Democrats are trying to bring both Clinton and Obama here to get the base fired up because Mary Burke doesn't fire anybody up. Nobody looks at Mary Burke and says, wow, there's somebody I want to vote for. They hate Scott Walker. The other flip side is when you look at Democrats, when Tom Barrett was running the recall election, all he got was a tweet from Barack Obama a couple days before the recall. Now actually Mary Burke's getting a presidential visit, which is a nice thing, but I do think it's going to have the effect of driving up turnout in the areas that the Democrats want to drive it up in Milwaukee, but it's not going to help statewide.
See, I think you were right before, Dan, when you said that Mary Burke's one of her goals was to make herself as vanilla as possible, to make herself as non-controversial, not threatening as possible, and up until now she has avoided being on that stage with Barack Obama. To a lot of voters, that injects a certain level of controversy that she's avoided so far.
Well, I'm just trying to envision the voter who's sitting at home saying, I'm probably going to sit this one out. Oh, Obama's here, now I'm going to go out and vote for President
that's an interesting point. Or the other way around. Now, you may not want to hear it, but we will tell you anyway. Let's hand out some unsolicited advice. Michelle Litchens, you're first.
Well, for anyone who thinks Mark Harris is a conservative Democrat, he is not. He proposed a countywide sales tax. He only balanced his budget because the state required him to balance it, and he would invest in solar and wind energy instead of stopping the EPA's coal regulations.
Dan Adams.
To Green Bay Alderman Chris Weary, you shouldn't question whether one of your constituents supports terrorist groups simply because she's a Muslim. Get a clue.
Brian Sikma.
Well, my unsolicited advice is for Wisconsin Democrats. When you pick John Lehman as your lieutenant governor candidate, you slapped Wisconsin's 165,400 Vietnam veterans in the face. Lehman's a convicted Vietnam draft dodger who served time for his crime and never expressed remorse for refusing to serve his country.
Yeah, maybe that's why the Democrats never mentioned his name. My unsolicited advice is to Milwaukee Police Chief Ed Flynn. Chief, you're nearing the end of your career and it has been a good and distinguished career, but you have to decide now. Would you rather have the respect of the rank and file men and women in your department, your fellow cops, or are you willing to trade that to make a politician like Tom Barrett happy? Think about it. Next on Sunday Insight, have you noticed the price of gasoline lately? What's going on? Gas prices dip below $3 a gallon. There's chaos in the Middle East, so that should be sending prices up, right? Well, not anymore. The United States is in the midst of its own energy boom, and drivers can see some of that at the pump. So is this good news, or is it just going to encourage folks to use more of those evil fossil fuels, Michelle Litchens?
Well, obviously, it's a good news for all of the consumers when gas prices go down. But we really need to look at how we are going to fund transportation of the future in the state of Wisconsin. I think the Republicans in the Assembly had a good suggestion by removing public transit and state troopers out of the transportation fund, but the state needs to find a way to bring more revenue into that fund because we are buying more fuel-efficient vehicles and we're buying electrical vehicles and they're not paying gas tax.
Well, but obviously if the price of gasoline goes down, the gas tax is still the same. It's not a percentage tax increase, so people will use more gasoline. I would guess that would drive up the revenues, wouldn't it?
Well, I think you're right, Charlie. I mean, and this also proves, what 6 years ago, what conservatives were saying, that we need to drill more in the United States to access our own oil reserves. That's why actually prices are going down today, is because the U.S. is producing now more than it has for any time in the past 30 years. When it comes to the idea of how to fund this transportation fund, I mean, the gas tax, as you point out, both the state and federal gas tax are fixed fees. So whether the gas costs $4 a gallon, $3 a gallon, or $2 a gallon, you're paying the same amount of taxes. Vehicles have gotten more efficient, but this is a time, I think, for the state to begin to assess its priorities. Really, there's two federal members, Senator Ron Johnson and Congressman Reed Ribble, have proposed getting rid of the federal gas tax and giving all that money to the state, which would allow us a lot more flexibility in state to meet our own transportation needs.
Would that be a good idea, Dan Adams?
Well, hey, the reason why gas is going down is because the Saudis are dumping oil on our markets. They're going to pull back at some point.
Fracking. Not fracking.
The U.S. still only produces 10%.
Get on a bus and go to South Dakota, North Dakota, see what's going on there.
My car runs on unleaded, not liquefied natural gas. But listen, I think we need to start talking about revenue on a big scale in this state, and I'm glad that the governor is starting to talk about that.
Okay, but in terms of low energy prices, could we at least all acknowledge that this is good for consumers, this is good for the economy?
Absolutely.
I say this because your president's EPA, seems to be determined to drive up the price of energy, determined to drive up the price of gasoline, drive up the price of electricity. The president said that under his plans they would necessarily skyrocket.
Mitt Romney used $4 gas prices as a cudgel to beat Obama with. Now gas is at $3. I think he deserves some political benefit and some benefit of the doubt. Again, low energy prices are good for all of us. They drive manufacturing.
All right, I happen to agree with you, but I mean, there is a disconnect, because all of the policies that we are seeing, all the energy policies, will cause dramatic increases in the price of energy. And this is just one of those teachable moments, I would think, where people would say, okay, are we better off with cheap natural gas? Are we better off with cheap oil? Are we better off with cheap electricity or not?
And cheap renewables. I mean, we have to have a multi-pronged approach to energy going forward in the long term.
Okay. As long as they're not subsidized.
I was just watch that, right.
Well, that's part of the problem is because they're not that cheap. They are very, very expensive. Okay, what is it you don't get? Let's go around the table. Michelle Litchinger first.
Well, Charlie, what I don't get is the potty mouth princesses video where little girls are dressed as princesses and they repeat the F word over and over and over again, discussing inequality of women. How can the left think that belittling these little girls empowers women?
Dan Adams.
How sandwich chain Jimmy John's thought it would be a good idea to force its young delivery drivers to sign non-compete agreements. These anti-free market agreements are usually reserved for executives and high-tech engineers, not college kids trying to earn an honest buck.
I hadn't even heard that. Brian Sikma.
Well, Charlie, what I don't get is why President Barack Obama only gave Tom Barrett a simple tweet in the 2012 recall election, but is giving Mary Burke an entire visit for this gubernatorial election.
Well, what I don't get is how we now know more about Scott Walker's bald spot than we do about what Mary Burke has been doing for the last 7 years. Actually, I do get that. Great job, media. Next on Sunday Insight, our panel picks the winners and losers of the week. But first, here's your morning news update. It's time for our panel to pick the winners and losers of the week. Michelle Litchins, you're first.
CNN's Carol Costello laughed while playing the audio of Bristol Palin, who was dragged through the yard by a man she didn't know while he was screaming expletives at her. While Palin cried, Costello laughed. Abuse of conservative women is okay? I mean, the hypocrisy is too much. You are a loser. My winner is alternative media like Right Wisconsin, Media Trackers, the MacGyver Institute, Wisconsin Reporter, and so many others. Without these brave souls, the voters wouldn't know about Susan Hatt's record, John Doe's bias, among other countless stories. Thank you for doing the job of the press.
Dan Adams.
My winners this week are centrist moderates across the country. From Kansas to Georgia and yes, Wisconsin, moderate Democrats have remained competitive in a very tough midterm environment. Democrats should continue the strategy of seizing the political middle. My loser is Brian Sikma's favorite smooth jazz saxophonist, Kenny G, who deleted and disavowed a tweet he made in support of pro-democracy demonstrators in Hong Kong after the Chinese Communist Party voiced their disapproval.
Brian Sikma.
Well, my loser of the week is the city of Milwaukee. We learned, thanks to the work of the MacGyver Institute and Media Trackers, that the partisan pro-Democrat organization Wisconsin Jobs Now is receiving preferential treatment from the city to aid in its Get Out the Vote effort. Now, my winner of the week is Democratic gubernatorial candidate Mary Burke. She plagiarized her campaign jobs plan, but she did not plagiarize a strategic plan for the Department of Commerce when she was secretary. We know that because an email from her successor says Burke had no strategic plan while working for the state. Supposedly, she came up with strategic plans for a Trek bicycle, however.
Well, my loser, County Executive Chris Abley, who released 16,000 John Doe documents 2 weeks before the election, the same day that Mary Burke launched her first ad targeting the John Doe. Can you say coordination, sleazy? Winner, now it may not seem like it, but it's Scott Walker. He is the most vetted politician in history. If he had ever jaywalked, had an overdue library book, or tore the tag off his mattress, they would have crucified him. So what other politician could have had years of all of their private emails released and still come out squeaky clean? Thanks for joining us. Join me for my radio show Monday morning on News Radio 620 WTMJ from 8:30 until noon. Have a great week.
Why choose